This is my custom Inquisition army, and this is the Augur dropship, a transport designed to take soldiers into places so terrifying that the only member of the crew who's really allowed to know what they're up against is already dead. I built this thing in my last video, and by the way, thank you for the absolutely overwhelming support on that. The channel literally doubled in size, and I got my first ever video over 30k, so really, thanks a lot guys, that was mental. Those of you who watched that video may have noticed that a couple of things have changed, so let me catch you up on what I've done between now and then. One thing that might have seemed a little bit odd about the Augur is that it's covered in candles, which would probably be blown out every time it moves more than like 4 miles an hour, or goes out of the atmosphere, so I want to make a little servo skull who goes around relighting the candles. It's also wildly impractical, but it felt like exactly the kind of thing you'd see in some 40k Inquisition artwork, so I'm going to make one. I began by drilling a hole in the underside of the skull and gluing in a length of wire, which I then bent into a dangling, flowing cable shape. I then added some extra cables and put together the candle relighting arm from a few thin sections of plasticard, which are then glued onto the skull, adding a few spare rivets where the arm hinges. To sell that this was properly a servo skull and not just a regular skull, I was going to give it one of those mechanical eye things, which I did with a couple of small balls of brown stuff. After which, I marked out where I wanted the skull to sit on the ship and drilled a hole for the wire to slot into. I then gave the entombed pilot, or R2 Death 2 as you guys have taken to calling him, the same cyber eye to better sell that they're controlling parts of the ship. Despite this guy's fancy new eye, they really don't have a particularly good view for shooting these side guns. So I'm going to give this ship a couple of extra lenses that are going to be the camera feeds that this guy's looking out of. Does also get to see what this guy sees, but to be honest, he doesn't really have a particularly good view either. So we'll give them both a bit of a helping hand. For these I was going to use the scopes from the Scion's hotshot las guns, which I cut away from the rest of the gun and then flattened the backside of to make it a little less clear that it was a scope. I initially placed these on the little side ledges, but I didn't like how it looked, so I moved them to the underside of the wing. This would leave them kind of weirdly upside down though, so I cut away the main lens and rotated it so it would sit with the longest section at the top. The last major change to the ship I made was adding armor texture. I did the same thing on my basilisk last year, but this time I skipped the stage where I added texture with plastic cement. This was done quite simply by stippling Vallejo acrylic putty over all the areas I imagine are super thick, dense metal. After which I gave it a very light sand just to tone it down slightly. I don't think it came out particularly well this time, but I'm sure I'll get better at it, so if you do want to see someone do it well, check out Night Shift, who does it much better than me. The model did still have no base though. I probably could have done something cooler with the space I had, but I decided to go with something more simple. I made a corner ruin bit, which I had originally intended to be much bigger, but the flight stand takes up quite a large area on the base, which made that a little bit difficult. It ended up being a sort of low platform made out of plasticard, which I bent the edges of to look like deformed metal. And then finally, I added this little skeleton guy slumped up against the rubble. The bulk of the ground and the debris piles you've seen me sculpting were made with milliput, which then had skulls and rocks pressed into it, as well as the flight stand to make sure everything would fit. I made sure to remove the flight stand before it dried though, for ease of priming. After this, all I needed to do was add texture paint to the ground surfaces, and some sand to the areas I wanted to read as sort of concrete debris type material. Then, all that was left to do before priming was add some purity seals, some of which I stuck onto the model, but some of them, which I thought I might glue on top of freehands later, I kept separate. And then, it was time to spray it all black. And so now you're all caught up, let's get to painting. Now it's primed, it's much easier to see how all the different bits come together, and I'm pretty happy with it. There are quite a lot of repeated techniques on this model, so I'm going to talk about how I painted the main colours on the bulk of the ship, and then I'll come back to the base, the dead pilot, and the living pilot to talk a bit more about the lore. First off, I was going to deal with the main grey armour colour. I did this by sponging on a 50-50 mix of black and Eshin Grey, followed by Eshin Grey, and finally Mechanica Standard Grey, limiting myself to higher and higher sections of the model with each layer. Sponging is a super fast way to get this all done, but it also works very well to bring out the texture I've just added, and also avoid brush strokes on the otherwise very big flat surfaces. To further accentuate that texture, I washed the whole surface with Nuln Oil. But this did leave things a little shiny, so I used a layer of Storm Shield to dull things down again. After which, I did a light dry brush of Dawnstone, and we were done with the grey. Next I'm going to deal with all the sort of gold trim areas on the model. I'm going to base coat them with a 50-50 mix of Rhinox Hide and Balthazar Gold. Then give a layer of pure Balthazar Gold over the sort of top 50%, a wash of Agrax Earthshade to tone everything down a bit, and then finally an extreme highlight with a 50-50 mix of these two. This was a far more pleasant experience than it was when I painted the Basilisk, the only other vehicle in the army, because there was a much more reasonable amount of trim, which I also think just looks better. Less really is more with this stuff, but Games Workshop's chaos designers clearly do not share my opinion. With those two starting colours out of the way, I could start to add the red accents. For this I added a couple of lines on the front sides and the wings of the ship, with a 50-50 mix of corn red and black.
I've definitely put these in the wrong place. It's going to be really annoying to fix.
But once I'd managed to repair the grey and put the red lines in their new correct position, I could then layer up unevenly with corn red to emulate that uneven armour texture, and then finally highlight / layer with Mephiston red. After which I repeated the same steps on the red wax of the purity seals. Apart from putting the red in the wrong place and starting all over again, that was optional for the seals. Then I tackled the gun casings and sort of electrical box style miscellaneous details with a 50-50 mix of corn red and Cantor blue, highlighted with corn red and then Mephiston red. The last of the big areas left to paint were the gunmetal sections. I used a black base coat with a dry brush of Iron Warriors and then lead belcher on the larger surfaces, but on the detailed areas I just layered the two. After which I used some old formula Nuln Oil to darken and dull everything down. If you don't have the old stuff, just use the new stuff and use the same Storm Shield dulling things down method I did earlier, or some other semi-matte varnish if you don't have Storm Shield. Now it was time for some details. I'm going to deal first with my favourite, the Parchment and Bones. These share most of the same steps, these being a Gothor brown base coat but avoiding all the deepest recesses where I left the black showing, followed by a layer of Baneblade brown. This is where the process ends for the Parchment, but to push the bones a little bit further and differentiate the two, I had a final layer of Screaming Skull. The candles were then painted with a Xandri Dust base, a wash of Seraphim Sepia, and a layer of Morghast Bone. I tackled the glowing wicks of the candles and the searchlights in pretty much the same way, with a couple of orange and yellow glazes over a white base coat, with the lightest colours in the middle or top to emulate a light source.
The brush I was using is my sort of super fine brush throughout this project. I think it's actually a normal brush, and just all but one bristle have fallen off.
With that, the bulk of the model is done, but we do still have a lot more to do. To give myself a bit of a break from the ship, I'm going to paint the base. This is meant to represent a planet on its way to becoming a demon world. It's not quite gone yet, but things have gotten really pretty bad. I'm going to keep the ground relatively normal, with a Rhinox hide as a base coat, and dry brushes of Gothor and Baneblade brown. But I'm going to rely on the bones, blood pools and ruins to point to the fact that this planet really is in a bad way. This army is only called in when a planet has succumbed to chaos enough that regular human regiments would be far more likely to fall to chaos themselves than do any good. But things haven't gotten so bad that it's worth calling on the comparatively limited number of the Grey Knights. Things like the blood pools, which are made from Vallejo's still water and painted with mixtures of Black Legion and Blood for the Blood God, are meant to hint towards these early stages of the planet becoming unnatural under the influence of the warp. And after adding in a couple of tufts, I could call the base done, and turn my attention back to the Augur. The first of the remaining details I was going to tackle was the Entombed Pilot. This is the guy who controls all of the ship's weapon systems, a bit like a big servo skull. He's part of a group known as the Immortals. They're the skull-faced infantry we've seen up to this point, who've gone through the necessary initiations and training to be deemed able to withstand the horrors of the warp, or at least enough to effectively fight them without losing their minds. And to mark this, have been granted the honour of wearing the bones of their predecessors. The numbers of the Immortals are limited and replenished so that at any one time there are always exactly the same number of them, though not 10,000 like I originally suggested. There's a couple more than that. These wires feed this guy all of the information from the sort of side cameras and the pilot's visor, and they let him control the guns on the sides a little bit better than the view that he's currently getting from this lens. These relic dudes aren't really meant to be in control of any other ship systems, but for some reason the engineers just really can't figure out. They do actually seem to have some kind of influence over quite a lot of other things this ship does. Then I turn to the living pilot. As I mentioned last time, their helmet stops them from seeing the chaotic entities the army's fighting, just by censoring the areas of their vision where whatever they're fighting is. Just like the SCP scramble goggles these were based on, they did have some issues in their early development, but they've reached a point now where they are reasonably safe. They have to wear these because they are not immortals. Instead, they're part of a lower rank whose name I actually haven't come up with yet. They haven't gone through all the same training as the immortals and so are too great a risk to actually show demons. But they do still have quite a lot of very valuable skills and experience to lend to the army, so they can be found quite often in roles that don't actually involve pointing guns at evil creatures. There are actually quite a lot of these guys in this force, but since they're not usually on the front lines, I haven't needed to make many yet. Though once I can get my hands on more of these heads, you will definitely be seeing more of these fellas. With that finished, we were really on the home straight. The servo skull was pretty quick and fun to paint, the struts and the canopy were less so, but with them finished there was only really one last hurdle.
So it's finally time to do some freehand, which I've been putting off for ages. Mainly because I'm planning on putting the symbol for the whole army here, and I just can't really come up with a good one. I've been thinking about it for a really long time and I'm really struggling. I think I'm just going to put a sort of placeholder symbol here that I think will look cool, and then when I eventually properly decide what the army's logo is going to be, I can come back and fix it.
My chosen placeholder was this winged skull with the Inquisitorial rosette on the forehead. I started with this very rough shape in white, after which I could refine things with very thin black lines, which does seem to have worked pretty well. The rest of the freehands were much quicker and simpler, and I also added some of these warning sigil transfers to these panels on the thrusters. And now, all that was left to do was assemble the model, and at last, the Augur dropship was finally finished. Well, there we have it. This has been my largest conversion yet, and it really has been a massive project. It's been a pretty flat out month trying to get this thing finished because I've had a lot of really important real life stuff going on, so sorry it's a bit late. I gotta say, I really dig how this model came out, and I think it fits in really well to the rest of the army. I do think the armor texture could have been better though. It's very possible it would have looked better without it, but I'm gonna have to keep on doing it to get better. So you're probably gonna see a couple more subpar armor textures before I'm where I want to be. My favourite addition though might be the little servo skull. It feels to me exactly the kind of thing you'd see in the art, and I really think it brings some life to an otherwise very blocky model. Also, it's just a really fun little mini project, so I highly recommend you all try putting one together for yourselves. As always, do let me know if you have any ideas for this army, whether they're conversions, logos, or a name for that rank that the pilot is from. Whichever it is, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. Once again, thanks for the amazing support on the last video, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.